You wanted to begin, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Because this is an official meeting, I'm going to ask that we do a roll call, please. And I think,
Okay.
Sharon, you have...
Yes, sir. So Chairman
Please.
Torian, Delegate Sickles,
Present.
Delegate Plum,
Here.
Delegate Tyler,
Here.
Delegate Bulova. Delegate Bulova, you may need to unmute. Delegate McQuinn.
This is Delegate Bulova. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Delegate McQuinn. Delegate Carr.
Here.
Thank you, ma'am. Delegate Kresick.
Here.
Delegate Aird.
Present.
Delegate Hayes.
Here.
Delegate Hurst.
Present.
Delegate Jones.
Present.
Delegate Reed.
Present.
Thank you, sir. Delegate Cox.
Here.
Delegate Knight.
Here.
Delegate Moorfield.
Here.
Delegate Ferris.
Yes.
Good morning. Thank you,
I'm
Delegate
here.
Ferris. Yes, sir. Thank you. Delegate Rush.
Here.
Delegate Davis.
Present.
Delegate Austin.
Present.
Delegate Bloxham.
I'm here.
Thank you, sir. And Delegate Brewer.
Here.
Mr. Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you all for joining us. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us this morning. We're holding this meeting in preparation for reconvening session, our veto session that will be on Wednesday of this week. So I thank you all for joining us. Obviously, you know that we have quite a few amendments being presented by the governor. And so what we would like to do this morning is go through those amendments to HB 29 and HB 30. Ann will be leading us through this presentation, and I will ask that we all hold our questions until we get to the end of the presentation, and then we will entertain your questions. So as we go through the presentation, if you have questions, just mark them, write them down, and then once we get to the end, we'll come back and entertain your questions. Ann, welcome, and it's in your hands.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning.
I'm going to provide an overview of the amendments, and then we will go through them more specifically, staff by staff. But in overall perspective here, we are in unknown territory with regards to the financial impacts of COVID-19. Through March, state general fund revenues still exceeded the forecast, but obviously everyone expects that we'll see dramatic declines going forward based on the massive economic contraction and unemployment levels. Just over the past 4 weeks, Virginia has had 411,000 unemployment claims, the equivalent of about 9% of the state's overall workforce. Because the situation is so unprecedented, it did not seem wise to try to undertake a reforecast at this point in time. There simply isn't enough information available on which to base the forecast. So the assumption is that what you are doing now will provide some interim measures as a hedge until things stabilize. Hopefully later this summer, the governor can undertake a reforecast at that point, and the General Assembly could come back in a special session to implement longer-term solutions to the problem before you. I've already skipped one extra slide ahead. In terms of House Bill 29, or the caboose bill, the governor has a total of 37 amendments. 7 of these are financial in nature. The 3 largest, there's the removal of the proposed $602 million deposit to the Revenue Reserve Fund that was to be made before June 30th of this year. This will provide additional liquidity to offset any shortfalls that you experience. There's also a request to increase appropriations by $50 million in central accounts for unbudgeted COVID-19 expenses. This is largely intended to match federal dollars. Some of the pots that have become available, like funding for the Department of Elections, does require a 20% state match. You also see a front page adjustment of $58 million. It's a reduction in the balances, recognizing spending the governor has already authorized, largely at the Department of Emergency Management, but some also at Housing and Community Development pursuant to his state of emergency declarations. The net result is that the assumed unappropriated balance that you left here with of $692 million would now be almost $1.2 billion if those funds are not needed to address the shortfall in the current fiscal year. Of the remaining 30 amendments, 26 are language items specifically related to relaxing requirements regarding the conduct of business during COVID-19, and there are 4 language amendments for unrelated purposes. Moving to House Bill 30, the governor has a total of 144 amendments. 83 of these are unallotments that are designed to unallot all new discretionary spending included in House Bill 30. These are both proposals the governor had included in the introduced budget, as well as items you had adopted. These are set out in standalone items at the very end of each agency's budget. There's a table in each that lists the specific programs that are to be unallotted and the dollar amounts by year. So you can see that in detail under each agency. There's also language accompanying each of these amendments that stipulates that the spending will essentially remain frozen until the General Assembly has adopted a revised revenue forecast and verified that sufficient revenues are available to support the appropriations. In total, the unallotments are about $875 million the first year and $1.4 billion the second year. This is different from prior economic downturns and revenue shortfalls that you've experienced. Instead of actually cutting funding, this essentially is freezing it with the assumption that the General Assembly will return later this summer or early fall and either unfreeze the spending, the revenue outlook happens to improve, or if the forecast declines further, choose what spending to eliminate permanently, as well as any additional actions needed. The table on page 7 simply summarizes the total spending reductions contained in the amendments. You'll see that there's $551 million net in the caboose bill. Again, that money would carry forward to the next biennium if it is not needed to offset a shortfall. In FY21, the unallotments and cash reductions total just under $1 billion. And just to give you a point of reference, the current revenue forecast for FY22 is growth of 4.3%. This $966 million represents about 4.1% of the total revenues. So for this to be sufficient to offset a forecast, revenues would still have to be above zero growth or 0.2% to meet that. So in all likelihood, you will have to make further reductions, certainly in the first year. The $1.4 billion in the second year translates to about 5.8% of general fund spending. In terms of the language proposals, and once again, I'm sorry, I've clicked ahead. There are 49 language amendments in House Bill 30. Of this total, 32 are COVID related. Many of these are duplicates of amendments in House Bill 29. So as we move through the PowerPoint, we discuss them just once. And then there are also 17 language amendments that are unrelated to the current crisis. 10 of these are technical corrections, and they're set out on slide 8 for you. And there are 7 non-COVID related substantive changes as well. In addition to the 2 budget bills, the governor also has proposed amendments to 23 other bills that came through the Appropriations Committee. 12 of these have delayed enactment dates, 12 have technical changes, and 10 have amendments that are more substantive in nature. We are not going through these in the PowerPoint today because of the length of the material we have already, but there is a write-up of the amendments to each bill, which was considered by the committee, which is on the Appropriations website and was also emailed to all of the members late last week. So with that, we will begin discussion of the unallotments on slide 11, and staff will go through these by area.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, the governor's amendments to the budget include unallotting about $23 million of new spending over the biennium for the compensation board. These items are largely related to salary and staffing related actions. On the next slide, continuing on the Secretary of Administration, you can see here that in addition to the compensation board related actions, the governor's amendments to the budget unallot about $5 million over the biennium for election related staffing, bringing total savings for the administration secretariat to just under $29 million over the biennium of general funds. On slide 13, shows the proposed savings for the Commerce and Trade Secretariat. This includes $6 million over the biennium in discretionary increases for incentive programs and substantial savings for the Department of Housing and Community Development. This includes $6.6 million of unallotments for the Eviction Prevention and Diversion Program, $46 million for the Housing Trust Fund, and $32 million for the Virginia Telecommunications Initiative, which addresses broadband issues over the biennium. On slide 14, the unallotments for Commerce and Trade Secretariat continues. You'll see here that the governor's amendments to the budget unallots 13 new positions related to safety and health at the Department of Labor and Industry. I'll note here that the budget does retain the 15 new positions that we put in there for the agency's labor law division related to the legislation passed this session. Continuing on, the governor's amendments unallots discretionary increases at VEDP for 2 programs, which totals about $17 million over the biennium. Taken all together, the governor's amendments propose unallotting $118 million over the biennium for the commerce and trade related agencies. On the next slide, slide 15, the governor proposes unallotting a deposit of $300 million in FY22 to the Revenue Reserve Fund, as well as money in the budget for a new position at the Department of Treasury. With that, I will turn it over to Zach to go over K through 12.
Thank you, Kim. The governor proposes unallotting $185 million in FY21 and $305 million in 22 for direct aid to K-12. Over half of the unallotted amounts can be attributed to the 2% pay increases for K-12 staff that were proposed. Other major areas that were proposed for unallotments include the early childhood expansion, as well as a portion of the at-risk add-on expansion, because at-risk add-on is partially lottery funded. The lottery portion is not impacted by the unallotments. Also, new and expanded funding for grants and aid to organizations are unallotted as well, and they continue on to the next slide and are listed on 16 and 17. And here's the total amount of $185 and $305 million. Moving on to slide 18, new funding initiatives at the Department of Education are unallotted, about $1 million in FY21 and $8 million in FY22. These unallotments, none of the K-12 unallotments impact any of the funding associated with bills passed by the General Assembly, which we'll discuss the school counselor issue later on. It was not included with these unallotments. And now I'm going to pass it over to Tony for higher ed.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Chairman. So what you see before you is a slide that summarizes the impacts on higher and other education. Basically, there are 35 unallotment amendments. It unallots $190.7 million in the first year and $166.7 in the second year. Essentially, that's all the new funding. You had appropriated about $190.9 and $167. The only two amounts that survived are there's some money for the student ombudsman of $200,000, and it also retains some money in the Commission for the Arts for administrative costs of about $250,000. But moderation, online, financial aid, all those things are all now unallotted. Susan is next on slide 20.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'll start with the health department. First of all, overall, there's about $315 million in unallotments in health and human resources. In the health department, you'll see there's a lot of dribs and drabs here. I would just say that the first 6 items were ones that were in the introduced budget. The ones that start with new were ones that you all had put in, and you can see the totals down below there. My screen is a little obscured there on the bottom, but I'll just move on to the next slide. DMAS is where you see greater numbers there. The first slide just shows you all the unallotments related to the provider rates. The one thing I would just note there is the only one large item that did not get unallotted was for the personal care provider rate increase of 5% the first year and 2% the second year. That totaled about almost $65 million. If you go on to the largest one here is just the refresh for the waivers. Going on to the services, this totals about $133 million over the biennium. The largest is the first one, the dental benefits. These are all unallotted. Going on to the next slide, I've combined for you, just showing you the eligibility unallotment there for the 40 quarters for legal permanent residents, and then some administrative items. And then you see the totals there of almost $80 million the first year and $128 million the second year for the unallotments in DMAS. Going on to the next agency, Department of Behavioral Health. And what I've done here is I've kind of segregated these between central office, then the grants to localities, which are the funding that goes to your CSBs. The facilities come last. So in central office, you'll see there's about $21 million the first year and 26 the second year. Largest, of course, being the first 2 on there for discharge assistance plans and pilot programs for facility census reduction. Looking at the CSBs on the next page under grants to localities, the largest is, of course, the continuation of the implementation of STEP Virginia. That's 19.7 the first year and 30 the second year. There is some language attached to that specific amendment that requires that eliminates the requirement that CSBs go ahead and move forward with STEP Virginia. So it just keeps it at the amounts, at the STEP Virginia services that are provided in the current budget, unless there's an appropriation and allotment of funds made to move forward on that. Mental health hospitals are listed there as well, about $8.8 million, and then grand total for Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services is about 55 the first year and 86 million the second year. Moving on to the next agency, DSS. Again, I sort of categorize these for you in terms of child welfare services, the Family First Prevention Services Act initiatives, benefits and other, and then some admin costs. The largest really of unallotments here has to do with the Family First Prevention Services Act initiative. And you'll see that in the middle of the page there. And that totals about $45 million over the biennium for those activities. And then going to the next page, you'll just see the total there for DSS is about $32 million the first year and $41 the second year. And I just will point out there that there were some salary adjustments in the agency itself to bring the local minimum staff salaries up, and that was about 10 or 11 million over the biennium there. Then in the there's a couple other agencies, CSA, Department for the Aging and Rehabilitative Services, and the Department for the Blind and Vision Impaired. These are all smaller amounts that total about $4 million the first year and about almost $4 million the second year. And then just in terms of the language, there is some language related to unallotments for DMAS and DSS, and I've set out here the amendments that are affected in 29 and 30, and they just require an estimate and report on the general fund savings that would be available due to the fact that the federal government is increasing the Medicaid assistance percentage from 50% to 56.2 during the COVID-19 emergency. And there's some language that they have to report the estimate, and then DPB would unallot those general fund savings. Just preliminarily, it's going to be about $331 million for DMAS and another $5.6 million in DSS. And I would just indicate here that percentage is calculated on the base Medicaid program. It would not affect the enhanced, the expansion population because they're getting a higher match rate already.
Okay, moving on to slide 30. As you can see here, for VDACs and the Department of Forestry, the governor's amendments unallots a total of $1.4 million each year. Moving on to slide 31, for the major items in natural resources, there's been just over $55 million unallotted. This includes the supplemental deposits to WQIF, the various conservation and preservation funds, as well as dam safety funding. Moving on to slide 32, as you can see here, the new non-mandatory funding to support the various aspects of DCR's operations have been unallotted. Moving on to DEQ, a total of $18.1 million has been unallotted over the biennium. This was for the new permitting and regulatory staffing, as well as equipment for its various protection programs. Moving on to slide 34, all of the one-time as well as ongoing expenditures within historic resources have been unallotted. This is primarily for the various one-time appropriations for the museum and cultural initiatives funded in the first year. Moving on to slide 35, VMRC, all of the new non-mandatory funding has been unallotted. This is listed here. In the judiciary, just over $26 million has been unallotted over the biennium. The largest amounts here are the additional district court clerks positions, as well as the funding for additional public defenders at the Indigent Defense Commission and additional civil housing attorneys at the State Bar. On slide 37, you can see that just over $42 million over the biennium has been unallotted at DOC. The largest items here are the targeted salary adjustments for correctional officers, as well as the pilot program to be operated by UVA and VCU. And it also unallots the new general fund support for the department to procure electronic health records. At DCJS, on slide 38, the largest item unallotted is the additional funding to localities with police departments. This is HB 599 funding. All of the other non-mandatory new spending items have also been allotted. So this would include pretrial and local probation service expansion, as well as various grant programs for local public safety. Moving on to slide 39, as you can see here, for the other public safety agencies, all new non-mandatory spending has also been unallotted. The largest item here was an IT expense within VDAM. Finally, Veterans and Defense Affairs, a total of about $6 million over the biennium has been unallotted. The largest single item was the funding for the National Museum of the U.S. Army in Fairfax County. There's also been the removal of several new positions for the Department of Veteran Services, mental health and benefit services positions. Passes off to Michael.
Okay. On slide 41, this just shows the total unallotments related to compensation actions. It's $596 million across the budget, including $265 million within central accounts, which was already tied up, contingent on the current year's revenues not being greater than 1%. A shortfall greater than 1% of what was in the budget anyway, so that would have gone. Going to the next slide just shows the other unallotments in central accounts and independent agencies. There's $4.7 million each year from the Workers' Compensation Commission for funding that was included in the introduced budget for additional perk kits, and then the other funding were things that were included in the introduced budget related to just different central accounts items. The biggest one was increased rent costs for security related to basically the seat of government. They were going to charge more. DGS was going to charge more for agencies for enhanced security efforts around around the seat of government. Moving on.
On slide 43, on capital outlay, there are three items that had cash associated with. You see them before you: the $1 million for the Accomack hangar, $10 million for the general fund portion of the planning, and then $10 million for the Virginia Beach project. And now we move on to the COVID language items, beginning on slide 44.
All right. So the governor proposes language in both House Bill 29 and House Bill 30 to allow Virginia to respond to continued changes at the federal level related to unemployment insurance program. Specifically, the language is geared towards eligibility for unemployment benefits, particularly such as kind of the work search requirements in order to receive unemployment. Moving on, at the Department of Housing and Community Development, there are two amendments in House Bill 30 that would allow the agency to waive match requirements for federal and state homelessness funds. And then there's another language amendment in there, Amendment 16, that will allow the agency to use housing trust fund dollars in a flexible manner to respond to COVID-19 impacts. Moving to slide 46, there is language that authorizes CCAM to use its matching dollars for the purpose of attracting federal COVID-19 research-related dollars to Virginia. And now I'll turn it over to Zach.
All right, thank you. So to address the abrupt end of the school year, amendments proposed for both bills would authorize the superintendent of public instruction to grant waivers to statutory requirements. This amendment addresses graduation requirements that have been inserted into the code throughout the years and otherwise cannot be administratively waived. Some examples include the graduation requirement for students to complete CPR training or to complete virtual coursework. This would also address the code requirements that SOL tests be administered, as well as some requirements around teacher licensure. For accountability purposes, prior to granting a waiver, a justification would need to be provided to the Secretary of Education, and waivers would be reported to the Board of Education and posted on the BDOE website. Next slide, please. Other proposed K-12 language amendments include authorization for the department to suspend or prorate supplemental lottery per pupil payments to school division. should lottery proceeds fall short of projections. Another proposed amendment would waive local match requirements for state SOQ payments and other K-12 funding. This amendment addresses the fact that the school year ended early, so some school divisions have not yet incurred sufficient expenses needed to meet the local match. And this amendment is only in the caboose bill and impacts only the current school year. Finally, the new school counselor ratios in House Bill 1508 and Senate Bill 880 would be superseded through budget language. The counselor ratios will be held at their current levels for the biennium, and that would save $22 million in FY21 and $28 million in FY22. And now I'm going to hand it back to Tony for higher ed.
Okay, so the First Amendment essentially all it does is it clarifies the tag eligibility and then recognizes that students may continue to be going online in the fall of 2020 due to COVID, so as not to impact their tag awards. Then there are two amendments, one at Norfolk State, one at Virginia State, which essentially expands authority that you've already provided to both institutions for the use of year-end balances from the state funds for the Office of Civil Rights Agreement that was passed several years ago. And then lastly, this was a recommendation that we had sent over to them, which was in language in 29 and language in 30 would provide flexibility for institutions not to have to fully recover indirect costs related primarily to the fact that they have cash flow issues in auxiliary due to the closing of dorms and dining halls. On slide 50, there's some language allowing, again, you've already authorized higher education to carry forward about 3% of their unspent balances in E&G. This would up that amount to 6%. Again, it helps them with their cash flow. And then lastly, there is language in 29. Again, this is also related to auxiliary that would allow institutions to request an anticipation treasury loan, again, due to the results of the closure of some of their dorms and dining halls. The guidelines are still to be developed on this one by the secretary, and these may be more of a deficit loan than an anticipation loan if students don't show up. Susan, I think moves on now with slide 51 in DMAS.
In DMAS, you'll see in both 29 and 30 amendments that would provide for them to have the authority to make some policy changes and spend for that for things such as the use of telemedicine, waiving service authorizations, and eliminating cost sharing for recipients. And you'll see there the amounts in 29, about $308,000 general fund and $1 million general fund in 2021. Also in both 29 and 30, you'll see increases for nursing home and specialized care rates by $20 per day per patient. I've provided you with an estimate for 20 there. It's about $6 million general fund plus the enhanced federal match. Those costs will largely be absorbed by the Medicaid managed care plans, who must spend about 85% of their Medicaid revenue on medical care or quality activities. And that's usually, you'll hear somebody refer to medical loss ratio or MLR. And so the federal rules really require them to spend that amount. Otherwise, they're going to have to pay back the program in the following year. So really, the coronavirus has resulted in lower medical costs to the plan. So it really is kind of essential that they go ahead and incur some medical costs that will bring down their future liabilities. Next slide. There's also temporary authority to make changes to the medical assistance programs, either Medicaid, FAMUS, or CHIP in response to COVID-19. It's both in 29 and 30, subject to approval by the governor, and it has to be reported within 15 days of implementation to the DPB director and the chairs of the money committees. There's no language in there that shows you what those changes would be, so I've given you a couple of possible actions that you could theoretically see, like they could suspend the replacement requirements for DME equipment or prosthetics or orthotics or supplies that are lost, destroyed, or damaged. without requiring a face-to-face request or a new physician's order or medical necessity documentation. There's also language amendments that provide authority to adjust the payment dates in order to maximize the enhanced federal matching funds, and this is in 29 and 30 as well. And we did this way back when, I think during the Great Recession with Medicaid, when there was enhanced federal matching dollars. So, for example, they could advance the capitation payments to the managed care organizations at the close of the enhanced match period, just to make sure that we do maximize the federal allowable funds, just by moving payment, even in the fee-for-service program, moving payment rates up by a week would help them get the enhanced match rate. Next slide. In DBHDS, there's temporary authority in 30 to relax requirements surrounding licensing inspections. They usually have to do an annual unannounced face-to-face inspection. There's also the language would extend the period of a conditional license beyond the 12 months until December 1, 2020, because that also requires face-to-face visits. And then they can issue licensing status letters to prevent the lapse of the license in children's residential facilities, again, due to their fact that they can't do an on-site inspection. And it extends the period of renewals. In DSS, this is largely related to the Child Care and Development Block Grant and child care. There's $66 million that is provided in House Bill 29 federal dollars that are going to come down through the Federal CARES Act as incentive grants to child care providers. It also allows them to do emergency child care and to eliminate co-payments for child care subsidy participants and extend the absence days due to temporarily closed centers. And that just, the detail underneath there just sort of specifies those things out for you in a little bit more detail. Also, in 29, there's $2 million additional from the federal Child Care Development Fund balances to provide the full day child care for school-age children and their siblings. And again, that just comes out of existing balances, which totaled over $100 million as of December 31st. And then they exempt the child care license programs from licensure. This is both in 29 and 30 if they serve children of essential personnel. And then they waive background checks if they've been completed within the last 2 years, allow for the background check portability, and then they allow schools to operate emergency child care programs. Next slide. In DSS, there's also language to provide temporary authority to make any changes. It's very broad, changes to relevant state plans, request waivers, change eligibility criteria. And this is language in 29 and 30. Again, like DMAS, it's subject to written approval by the governor, has to be reported within 15 days, and to the Money Committee chairman and the director of DPB. And again, I've just put down there some potential possible actions that you could see. They could extend the renewal dates for April, May, and June for 6 months for the SNAP, TANF, and child care subsidy programs. DSS also indicated that they may want to increase the grant amount to the Federation of Virginia Food Banks. That would be another example. And I'll turn it over to David now for public safety.
Okay. Public safety, just one amendment that I'll speak about today. It's both in House Bill 29 and House Bill 30. What it does is authorize the DOC director to either release inmates or transfer them to lower levels of supervision. This is just giving the director a bit more flexibility as far as how they can manage the inmate population in response to COVID. The language does specify this is limited to the period in which a declared emergency is in place, and it would be limited to inmates with less than 1 year of their sentence remaining. And it doesn't exclude inmates convicted of Class 1 felonies or sexually violent offenses. And this would language has an expiration of July 1 of 2021. Moving on to, I believe, Kim next.
No, Mike. Transportation's next. Amendment on slide 57. There's two amendments related to transportation that related to the COVID-19. The first one is there is a suspension of the requirement to update the 6-year plan annually. Normally, the Commonwealth Transportation Board would be updating the plan by July 1st, so they're just going to keep last year's plan in place until next June. The other language amendment would give the CTB authority to transfer appropriations between programs and agencies as needed to ensure core services are provided regardless of any revenue shortfalls. Moving on to Kim for central accounts.
Yes, on slide 58, there's both bills include language that authorizes the governor to appropriate federal relief funds for COVID-19, as well as monies in the COVID-19 relief fund. The amendments include reporting language, as well as direct references to the games of skill legislation that proposes the creation of the COVID-19 relief fund. The only difference between the two amendments is that the amendment in House Bill 29 includes a $50 million appropriation in FY20 to provide state matching dollars if needed to draw down federal funding. Next, Tony will go over capital outlay.
Okay, so the first one, there are two language amendments, one in House Bill 29 and one in House Bill 30. And what the governor is requesting is that either he or his designee would have the authority to delay the initiation or continuation of any capital project that's supported by state funds. Now, for some context here, you already in Part 4 provide authority for the governor to withhold appropriations within certain limits. And some of the prerequisites for that is a revenue re-estimate, and that there be a written plan that is submitted in advance of any of the actions. So this language basically grant the governor the ability to implement several fiscal controls in advance of any revenue estimates and without prior notification to the General Assembly. If there's some kind of broad terms that are used there, delay continuation. The question is whether that means an existing project under contract. The other thing, the term state revenues, again, broadly speaking, could include non-general funds, although the explanation says that would not be the case, but it could. The other two items that are listed there, the first one is $1 million for VPBA bonds as a state match for a CARES grant for renovations to both Cedar Barfoot in Richmond and the Roanoke Veterans Care Center in preparation for COVID response. It's possible that the $50 million pool that was mentioned up front could handle this. And then lastly, I think Ann's already touched on that there was the maintenance reserve 65 million general fund was supplanted with bond proceeds. Moving on to Part 3 now on slide 60.
Okay. For Part 3, there are two amendments. One is in both House Bill 29 and House Bill 30, and this basically extends the deadline to pay taxes and instructs tax to waive any interest charges as long as people pay their income tax in full by June 1st related to any final payments or any payments that would due on or after April 1st. And then it also eliminates any interest charges on sales tax that were originally due March 20th, as long as they were paid by April 20th. The second amendment allows, in Part 3, which is also in both bills, allows the state comptroller to transfer end-of-the-year federal cost recovery balances to the general fund. And moving on to Part 4 next.
Right. In Part 4 on slide 61, there are language amendments in both bills that essentially authorize public bodies to conduct electronic meetings, agencies or the governor to alter cost factors when providing services in response to COVID-19, or allowing the governor or agencies to establish new services in response to COVID-19. On the next slide, slide 62, both bills, House Bills 29 and 30, outline a process for agencies to delay any report required by the code or the state budget by at least a year from the original reporting deadline. House Bill 29 contains amendment number 36. This is the amendment that proposes delaying elections scheduled for May 5th to November 3rd. Tony will continue on our overview of Part 4 on slide 63.
Okay, slide 63, I mentioned just before, section 4-102 is language that you have had in there for quite some time that essentially provides the governor with authority when revenues, when general funds don't meet, aren't adequate to meet the expenses, that the governor can then initiate certain actions within certain limits. One of the things that the governor can do is that the governor can reduce spending authority up to 15% for any agency. Certain items are excluded from that. You couldn't reduce debt service. You can't reduce employee benefit contributions. Can't reduce capital that is already under contract. And any other reductions of that 15% within an agency must be proportional. Lastly, the language then provides if the governor within his permissible authority cannot keep the budget balance, he would notify the General Assembly so that you can call yourselves into special session and you can take actions in order to balance everything. This language would essentially allow the governor to exceed the 15% cap on any item that's in the budget. We understand that there has been some calls to the governor and that he may withdraw this amendment, but this would be a significant shift in his authority. On slide 64, there are language amendments in 29 and 30. The federal government initiated a new program, the Municipal Liquidity Facility through the Federal Reserve Bank. This would allow for the issuance of $500 million of 9A bonds, which are used very rarely, and $250 million of 9D bonds, basically for the local participation. For us to participate in this program, the Federal Reserve would basically buy the notes, and it's meant to assist state and local governments to manage cash flows, primarily due to things that impact income tax collections with the deferrals or some of the potential reductions in tax revenues. Note that the 9A bonds do mature in 12 months, and the 9D bonds would mature within 2 years. And moving on now to other amendments.
On slide 66, as Ann mentioned in the front, the governor's amendment package includes several amendments that are non-related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Under the Secretary of Administration, there are amendments to both House Bills 29 and 30 that reverse the transfer of the executive mansion staff to the department from the governor's office to the Department of General Services. You may remember that the move that the General Assembly authorized would allow the mansion staff to earn overtime, which they're currently kind of prohibited from earning now due to their at-will status as governor's office employees. David will go over the next slide, slide 67.
All right. Just one amendment here. This was within VDAX. It's a technical amendment that would allow the department to continue operating its hemp research program in compliance with the federal farm bill. Moving back to Kim.
So Delegate Sickles' House Bill 1017 creates the Virginia Innovation Partnership Authority as the successor to CIT. Amendment 25 to House Bill 30 proposes a few actions for the new authority. First, it reduces general fund appropriations in the first year by $6.1 million. Second, it removes language approved by the General Assembly to allocate funds from the sale of CIT's building to the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative and the Commonwealth Commercialization Fund. Taken together, these two actions, as proposed in this amendment, zero out funding in the first year for the GAP Fund, the new Regional Innovation Fund that the bill creates, the Commonwealth Commercialization Fund, and technology industry development services. It also reduces funding for the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative to $7.5 million in the first year from the $17.5 million included in the enrolled budget. Just to point out, this amendment is unique from the 83 unallotment amendments to House Bill 30, and that it offers outright reductions to programs and funds for the new agency, including existing programs like CCI and the GAP Fund. Susan will cover the next slide.
Susan, you might be muted.
Yes, sorry about that. Let me start again. The first language amendment relates to CSA. You might remember that 2 years ago, you had authorized a study of the rates for private day special education services. Not all the providers responded to that study, and so we didn't get a good handle on the rates in order to determine whether or not to set a statewide rate at the time. The governor's introduced budget had about $250,000 in it to continue the rate study, and then the rates would be held in the first year to no more than 2%. But once the rate study was done, then the rates could be set centrally from the state for these particular providers. The language that the governor has got in House Bill 30 just requires the Office of Children's Services to provide the preliminary study findings of the rates to JLARC. JLARC's in the midst of doing a study of CSA. And then it requires the office to provide a final report by June 1, 2021. I don't know how this would differ at all from what they've already provided, so I'm not sure you're going to get anything more out of it. And I don't know if JLARC is planning on looking at rates specifically and doing anything more on it. In terms of the health department, there's an amendment that removes the requirement that funding for the long-acting reversible contraceptives be used solely for hormonal LARCs. It mirrors the language that the governor had put in the introduced bill, and that, and as you might recall, that the House had adopted that original language that was introduced by the governor, and coming out of conference, that was modified to bring it back to the current language that's in the budget today, that it be used only for hormonal LARCs. In DSS, it's just a paragraph of language which duplicates language that's already included in the enrolled bill in the Department of Education to convene a work group to plan to transfer the CCDF grant from DSS to DOE. And I think we can move on to the next slide.
Yep. On slide 70, this just shows some technical amendments underneath the Secretary of Finance. One including it delays a report from the work group convened by the Secretary of Finance and the Secretary of Administration to study collective bargaining for state employees by a year. Michael will cover the next slide.
Okay. Slide 71 shows 3 language amendments, 1 in transportation and 2 in natural resources in HB 29 that authorize, the transportation one authorizes $12 million in balances available within the Department of Transportation to move up to 25,000, well, move birds' nests from South Island, which is being disrupted based on the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel Expansion Project, and relocate them into other areas. Amendment 9, the amendments for the Secretary of Natural Resources and DGIF provide expertise and administrative support for the transition or the movement of the birds. The DGIF amendment is also included in House Bill 30. Moving on to the next slide.
On slide 72, For state police, there's language included that authorizes the department to provide anonymized data related to public safety research being conducted by UVA and Duke University. And Veterans and Defense Affairs, there's some technical clarifying language to the existing Camp Pendleton lease agreement language. And finally, there are two amendments which reverses the transfer of one position and $70,000 each year from DVS to the Veteran Services Foundation. This transfer, along with the transfer of $160,000 in pass-through funding, was part of the conference agreement that we came to in March. Moving back to Michael.
Okay. For transportation, there's an amendment in House Bill 30 that allows that it changes language in the budget that currently states that all toll revenues generated on I-64 must be used directly for projects to increase capacity on I-64. The language would allow it to be used for projects that are related to but not directly on I-64. And it does state that this could only be done contingent on agreement by the Hampton Roads Accountability Commission and the Commonwealth Transportation Board.
The amendment on slide 74 is a fairly technical amendment to money included in the budget related to redistricting. It essentially would allow DPP to transfer money to the Division of Legislative Services to begin the process of redistricting prior to the November 3rd election. And Tony will cover our last slide.
Okay, so there were two more amendments in capital outlay. The first one was for $6.8 million of bonds to expand the Nottoway wastewater treatment plant. Some context again here. We heard nothing about this during session, but we did provide DOC with $30 million of bond authority for blanket repair and renovation projects, under which this could probably be taken care of. And the last one is in Southwest Virginia, the Higher Education Center, $65,000 in bonds for equipment funding related to the building expansion. That's more technical than anything else. And that's it.
Okay, everyone. Staff, thank you all so very much for the presentation this morning. And so at this time, we will entertain questions. And for members of the committee, if you have a question, state your name first and then your question, please.
Mr. Chairman, Kirk Cox.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Tony sort of alluded to this, but if we could go to page 63, and I know we discussed this earlier with the conferees. Obviously, and some of it's necessary. There's a lot of expanded gubernatorial authority. I think two are frankly disturbing. One is this one. I think Tony summarized it well, but this is the Part 4 language that's been there as long as I can remember, that basically limits the governor's reduction authority to 15%. And this would allow him basically, in my mind, to sort of have too much control, do sort of whatever he wanted to as far as spending authority. And I think there's a good process already in place here. And if you look, and Tony once again, I think, hit this, but if they're not sufficient funds, and the General Assembly, which I think is important, is notified so that a special session can be convened, which is already going to happen. So I know some calls have gone out to the governor on that one, but I think that one in particular, Mr. Chairman, I would have some reservations. And the other one, not as bad, but the other one that was sort of pointed out was slide 59. And this is one dealing with delaying the initiation or continuation of any capital projects supported by state revenues. And once again, I think we have a process laid out here. And it's a small thing, but if you look at the Nottoway project, which we didn't get a great explanation of, which is a new project, I just don't think that we should have a process by which the governor can sort of pick and choose which capital projects to go forward with. So I think there's those are two that we need to take a look at. So I appreciate it very much.
Okay. I'm sure staff is taking notes of the concerns that are being mentioned by the members. Thank you, Kurt.
Mr. Chairman, Barry Knight.
Yes, sir.
And on budget items 19, 20, and 22, they were the birds at Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, $12 million. And we were going to try to check on that and see. We do not want to slow that project down, but we wanted to see if this was a condition of the federal permit or it's just something that the state wanted to do. Have we been able to check into that yet?
My understanding was,
Mr. Chairman, this is Mark. Go ahead. Michael.
So
I checked in on it.
What we heard was that the federal government would have required this if several years ago. However, based on current regulations, it's not required. That this is a state option is what we've been told.
Okay, that I thank you for that, because we may have more pressing with human beings than we do with the seagulls that are there. Also on the LARC, language in House Bill 30, it was budget item 74. You mentioned it here. Is it identified in House Bill 29 anywhere?
Delegate Knight, this is Susan Massart. No, it's not identified in 29 at all, other than the amendments that that the General Assembly adopted to 29, the enrolled 29, would keep the language similar to how it is today, in that it would only be for the non-hormonal or the hormonal LARCs, not the non-hormonal LARCs.
Okay, but we will not have an opportunity to vote on that in 29. Is that correct?
No, House Bill 29 is essentially the same language that is in the budget today. So I don't think you would have a concern about that unless you really felt like you wanted that should have been changed. But the General Assembly left the language similar to how it is today in the budget in 29.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Chairman, this is David Bulova.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So two questions. One dealing with the Housing Trust Fund. And I guess we're unallotting a good amount of money, but also providing some additional flexibility with regard to how the Housing Trust Fund can be spent. And I guess, Ann, maybe you can kind of help me out. When all is said and done, I think I had heard a concern that the Housing Trust Fund going into the next fiscal year would actually be lower than what it currently is in this fiscal year. Can you help me kind of understand where we are with respect to comparison between the two fiscal years once we have the unallotment?
A portion of that would be related to the fact that there was an increase in House Bill 29, which is not touched in the governor's amendments. The $7 million increase, and I'm looking up, I'm sorry, the current year numbers because I can't remember what that total is. Kim, do you have that in front of you?
The current year number in House Bill 29, the Housing Trust Fund is $7 million, and I believe the increase went to $14 million, I believe.
Okay, but in terms of moving forward, so we're back down to that $7 million, not balancing it off at $14 million going forward, correct?
Right. That's my understanding. Yes.
Okay. And so the next question I had, and I just wanted to make sure I understood this correctly, with respect to taxes, because I had heard previously, at least in terms of updates from the Secretary of Finance, The way it works is that filings are due May 1st, but that you had till June 1st in order to provide the payments, but that while it wouldn't be subject to penalties, that it would be subject to interest, which would be a disincentive with respect to why on earth would you wait for that extra month. But I guess my understanding from what I heard about the governor's amendment is that you would have a complete month grace period where no penalties and no interest. And so I wanted to make sure I understood that and also understood what is the hit to the budget by foregoing interest for that month.
If you read the actual language, it does not mention anything about penalties. It just says the interest shall not be charged. So I would think that would imply the penalties would also be waived. As far as the impact, I don't have that readily available. We can certainly look at that.
Okay, so that's not accounted for in any of the math?
Well, again, they haven't done any revenue reforecast. There's no dollars attached. It's language only. Okay. That would be a drop in the bucket compared to the total revenue reforecast.
Okay. Thank you very much.
The payments are due on May 1, so it is only because of this situation delaying it till June 1 that you would be accruing those penalties, except for those that are late. And I believe the distinction between the penalties and the interest, they have the administrative ability to waive the penalties, but they needed General Assembly authority to waive the interest. Thus, the budget amendment references only the interest.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, this is Glenn Davis. And someone's phone. Mr. Chairman?
Yes, go ahead.
I had a similar question as to David. So if I was looking at this properly, it still required payment to be made by June 1st. And I know we've all had discussions that the feds have delayed till July 15th. And for us to do the same would cause a financial quagmire financially as we go from the caboose budget to this year's budget. Given I think it was the bonds that were mentioned to help get through that period, could we not use those? I think there were 2A bonds, the 12-month bonds, to help us get through the period between June and July 15th, and at that point allow us to have our payment day the same as the feds. I know the reporting days are different, but it's kind of hard to do your states without doing your federal returns.
Mr. Chairman, I would say that in theory, that could be true. The administration has not proposed that, and it's not before you at this time. And one of the complicating factors, were you to do that, is you would not know how much money you had not received until you're into the following fiscal year, which would make the reforecast process even more difficult because you wouldn't know the extent of the reduction that was caused by the issues before us right now.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, this is David Reed. I have a question for Tony on slide 50, if that's okay.
Sure.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Tony, this is really kind of a two-part question. The carry forward part that we're talking about increasing from 3% to 6%, how long would that continue? Is that just for the duration of this budget, or would it become part of the normal course of doing business? So that's the first part of the question. And I'll let you answer that, and then that may determine where I go with the second part.
The budget itself has a 2-year life. You'll get another crack at it in special session, and then once again in the reconvene. So it'll be whatever y'all choose to want to do going forward. It'll be a choice of the General Assembly. So it could stay at 6, or you could set it back to 3, or you could do one more biennium. It's y'all's call.
Oh, okay, that answers the question. It's just for the duration of this budget. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Okay. Any other additional questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, this is Mark Nichols. Hi, I did talk to Nick Donahue about the bird problem at the south island of the HRBT, and there's two issues there. One is an endangered bird under Virginia state law. It's endangered under Virginia, not under the feds that has permanently nested there. They're trying to permit. This language would give them the ability to give themselves a permit to move the bird, and that's part one. There is no provision in law right now that gives them ability to get a permit on this endangered species. Number two is that the island has been used as a landing spot for migratory waterfowl over the years, and they're not there now. They come and drop down there when they're migrating, and the money, the $12 million, is going to be used to build either another island to attract them to, and also sink some barges to attract them away from the project. This is they're trying to prevent any delays in construction delays when the project gets up and running. They haven't got it all permitted yet, so that's part of it. The 12 comes from it's non-general fund. It comes from two unused parts of the they have that localities can use. One's the economic development fund, they're getting $8 million from, and one's a recreational access fund where these localities can present proposals to VDOT to draw that money down. So it's just $12 million in non-general funds to do this work to try to avoid a problem when the project gets underway and get it permitted to begin with.
So what is your question? I'm trying to.
That's the bottom. The bottom line is they considered emergency. That's why it's in HB 29. And if anybody wants to know more than that, call Nick Donahue. I can send you his cell phone if anybody doesn't have it. He's the deputy secretary, and explain why they need to do this as quickly as possible in their view.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All righty.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you all so very much. Yes.
This is Kirk again. Can I mention, I thought Mark was going to bring it up, and I think he's supportive of this. Amendment number 25, item 135, was discussed on the call, but it's the one that dealt with the Virginia Innovation Partnership Authority. And obviously, that's been a House initiative, and it was brought up on the call, but just want to emphasize that when we sold the CIT building, our priority was for that money to go to the cyber initiative and the Commonwealth Commercialization Fund. At the very least, I hope we sever those amendments, because I think what the governor's done is basically set up an entirely new process by which those grants would be awarded. Thank you for going to, it's page 68. Thank you. And I think that's one that we were very careful anyway. As I recall, the CCI money was less than the FY20 base level. So this is not new money, which was pointed out. So that's one I think we should look at. So that's my last comment, and I appreciate this opportunity, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, committee members.
Chairman,
thank you all for getting on the call today. Yeah. Mark?
I was just going to agree with the thoughts on that last provision. I mean, if they had unallotted this money because of this crisis, that would have been one thing. But they're just trying to get what they didn't get in the General Assembly session. So that's why I think we should put it back to the way the General Assembly wanted the program to operate.
And
so
Mr.
I agree with
this
Delegate
is
Cox.
I've looked into that, and those amendments would be severable. The first portion that is a general fund cut would stand alone, and then the new paragraph that they include to redirect the use of the existing non-general fund appropriation could be severed and handled as a separate amendment.
All righty. Thank you all very much, members of the committee. Thank you very much, staff members. Thank you very much for today's presentation. And I certainly hope that it has been helpful in our preparing for reconvene session on this coming Wednesday. Everyone be safe, have safe travel, and we will see you all on Wednesday. Thank you very much.